So welcome to social psychology. This is our first chapter. What is social psychology? And to start, we are going to actually ask a question. Have you ever done people watching? Now, if you're like me, you are someone who really enjoys watching people and understanding why people do what they do. I really like just thinking about why does somebody feel that way, behave that way, think that way. And social psychology is really going to get at how people act and why they act that way, specifically in social settings, but also in a broader context as well. We are going to talk about what social psychology is and what it is not as well. When we think about social psychology, we're going to think about these questions of what makes people do, think, and feel what they do. So, for example, what makes us feel attracted to another person? Why do some people help victims while other people appear to do nothing? What makes a good leader? What affects our initial impression of others? And what we need to distinguish is folk wisdom versus actual science. So, for example, I think you've probably all heard people say that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Excuse me, makes the heart grow fonder. But other people also say, out of sight, out of mind. There are a lot of people who are out there who will give you impressions of why people do what they do, but very few who will actually go out and do the research to figure out whether or not their impressions are correct or incorrect. Social psychology takes this idea of why do people do what they do, but instead of just basing it off of the past or traditions or superstitions or whatever else, we actually do the science to figure out why people do what they do and how we as humans work. Was your grandma right? Is one way to think about this. Well, social psychology wants to know the same questions, but instead of just giving the axioms or the proverb or whatever it is, we actually look at the science and look at the actual data to understand these things. So, when you hear things like absence makes the heart grow fonder, or out of sight, out of mind, compared or stay alive, don't drink and drive, do unto others as you would have them doing to you, opposites attract, birds of a feather flock together, money is power, time is money, money is power, and so power corrupts, and does time corrupt? Anyway, all of these things are things that people just kind of throw out there and say, hey, well, this is how it works, or hey, this is how it works. But opposites attract is different than birds of a feather flock together. Which one is correct? Social psychology is the way that we actually put science behind the reasons why people do what they do. By the way, opposites don't attract, it's birds of a feather flock together. We'll get to that in a different chapter. But the power that we have in social psychology is to understand these concepts, not just based off of what somebody happens to think or say or guess, but instead base it off of science. According to Einstein, common sense is the collection of prejudices acquired by age 18. And we're going to move beyond common sense and move into actual research and actual data. And that's what makes this so exciting. So let's talk about an example of this, of how this might work. So imagine that you go to a shopping center, for example, and somebody comes up to you who's collecting money for a charity. All right? They say, hey, will you donate to this charity? And it's a charity that you believe in. You think that it's a worthy cause. How likely are you to make a donation? Now, I want you to think about this. Instead of you making the donation, what is the probability that other people, not you, at the shopping center, will make a donation? The holier than thou effect is that we often think that we are much more likely to do things that are nicer or kinder or holier than other people would. When we actually look at this, we see that in general, people are likely to say, so this is, for example, what we would ask on a clicker question in a class. And when we do this, here's the kinds of answers we get. We get about a half and half of whether or not people are going to donate. All right. But when people answer the same question, these are the same people answering the same question except for other people instead of us, here's what we see. People think that they, like I, think that I am more likely to do kind and nice and generous things, and others are less likely. So this is others, and this is what people think for themselves. This is me, this is other people. Take a look at what you said you would do compared to what you think other people would do. So what's the difference? Are you significantly different than everybody else? It can't be that everybody is thinking this way if they think other people are going to be this way, right? So which one is correct? What's going on? Well, what we can tell with the data is that people are actually more likely to assume that I will make a donation when in reality, I don't think other people are going to do the same thing. What this means is that we have a bias towards ourselves in predicting what we're going to do. And that bias might reflect not only in something like giving money to a charity, but it can be the ways that we think about and specifically how we predict how other people are going to act. I know that my motives should be X, Y, and Z, but I think other people have different motives. Well, in reality, we're all humans, and so we should have relatively similar motives. And certainly we are biased when we think about what other people are going to do compared to ourselves. The definition of social psychology, this is a definition from Gordon Allport, who is one of the first people to create a textbook in social psychology. That's why it says 1924, and then that's been republished several times. But according to Allport, social psychology is a scientific discipline that attempts to understand and explain how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals is influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. Now, let's kind of break this down a little bit. You might notice a few things that are important. So, number one, this is a scientific discipline. That is important. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We're trying to understand thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals. And that's what psychology does. Now, we in social psychology are going to add on this extra step of the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. Now, that's pretty broad. That's pretty broad. Uh, in reality, social psychology is a very broad field. And when we're talking about the actual presence of others, that means real presence of others, but it can also be the imagined or even implied presence of other people. So the idea of, hey, how would you act if I want you to just think about your mother and think about what you're doing right now and see if you act differently, even just thinking about your mom. And I don't even have to be quite that abrupt. I can even have the implied presence of others. For example, there's a famous social psychology experiment where instead of actually having the face of a specific person or even having a stick figure, they just have two triangles and a circle, two triangles where eyes would be and a circle where a mouth would be, and people act differently even with shapes that are clearly not a person but are organized in a way that looks like a human face. We are social creatures and we act differently even with the implication that there might be other humans around. Social psychology, is it a science? And the answer is yes, because we use the scientific method. In fact, social psychology is very much involved with the idea of experimentation and finding unique and good ways to experiment on all of these things that we interact with in our normal social environment. So science is a huge part, and the scientific method is incredibly important in understanding psychology because that's the difference between us and common sense or just impressions that other people might have. We are a science and we use the scientific method. That means that we're going to refer to a lot of the different studies in this particular class because that's how we are gleaning our information and coming to our conclusions. The first study in social psychology is by Norman Triplett. Norman Triplett in 1897 or 1898, we're not quite sure exactly when it happened, but what happened is Norman Triplett was hanging out bicycle races, and it is true that back then they did have bicycle races. They didn't look quite like what you see here, but they did have bicycle races. And he noticed that they did the bicycle races in two different ways. One, everybody races against everybody else, just like you see here. But in another one, they would do time trials. and they just timed one person going around a track and see how fast they did. Well, if they did the same thing when other people were present, Norman Triplett noticed that people went a lot faster and completed the course a lot quicker if there were other competitors involved in the bicycle race. And he observed that and he said, wow, I wonder if that is really true. Do people actually perform better when there are other people around? But instead of just saying, hey, guess what? People perform better when other people are around, he decided to do an experiment. So here's what he did. He took fishing reels and he had exactly the same amount of reel, of line in the fishing rod. And he extended that out. And then he had boys wind up the fishing reel as fast as they could. They either did it with other boys or by themselves. And what he found is that when he timed them, they could wind the fishing reel significantly faster if there were other boys doing it with them. This led to the theory called social facilitation, which we'll talk about later on. But it was really the birth of social psychology in that this was the first experiment done in social psychology. And social psychology is all about the studies. We're all about the experiments and trying to use the scientific method to understand these phenomena that we're all interested in naturally. So who has had the most influence on social psychology? I want you to just tell me who you think had the most influence on social psychology. Well, notice how I did not ask you who was the scientist who had the most influence on social psychology. I asked who did. And according to many people, that's Adolf Hitler. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not saying that Adolf Hitler was a social psychologist or was somebody that we admire or study. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, we're kind of saying the opposite. So this social psychology is a branch of psychology that's relatively young. Use of experimentation to understand our everyday and normal phenomena that happens in the social world is pretty young. What had happened is in the early 20th century, there were a lot of psychologists, specifically in Germany, who were doing a lot of important work in perception. Now, by perception, we're talking about sensation and perception, meaning ideas like perceptual illusions and how we see objects versus the background and perception, that kind of perception, like visual perception. What happened is when Adolf Hitler came to power, many of those those Gestalt psychologists who were studying perception fled to the United States, and at the beginning of World War II, started to use their influence instead of in just visual perception and understanding how social perception works, so that they could help be involved with the war effort for the United States. So really, Adolf Hitler was important because number one, he basically kicked out many important psychologists who became the first social psychologists. And number two, he gave us a lot of, unfortunate, but a lot of ways and phenomena that we could study, like observations that we could see and say, hey, how does this really work? And can we understand these behaviors? One of the most famous social psychologists at the beginning of the history of social psychology is Kurt Lewin. Now, Lewin was one of those German scientists who fled Germany and came to the United States. That's why I say Lewin instead of Lewin. And he came up with something called field theory. And field theory is going to look like math, but it's not math. All right, don't worry about it. It's not math. This is not math. But Kurt Lewin's field theory is hugely important in understanding the basics of social psychology. Field theory is the behavior of it. When you say it in words, it's that the behavior of people is always a function of the field of forces in which they find themselves. I'll explain in just a second. The field of forces consists of two fields of forces that he was concerned with. One is the individual personal attributes, and the second is the social situation. And when he put this together, he created this formula. This is Kurt Lewin's field theory. It looks like math, but it is not. B stands for behavior. F is function. And then individual means individual personal attributes like your personality. And situation means the social situation. So what you need to figure out is Why does somebody um, let's think of a behavior. Why does somebody wear glasses, right? Is it because of their individual personal attributes or the social situation they find themselves in, right? So, for example, do I do it because, you know, I need them and that's what I do? Or do I do it because the social situation dictates? So let's think about another one. So, why would somebody wear a hat? The individual attributes would mean that they just like wearing a hat. That's what they're doing. The social situation is that the hat is in fashion or it's not in fashion. In reality, Kurt Levine's field theory is saying that behavior happens because of both of these. Part of it's your personality, and part of it's the social situation you find yourself in. But in social psychology, we focus more on the situation because it turns out people underestimate how much the social situation affects their behaviors. People in general underestimate the importance of the social situation and why somebody does what they do. In social psychology, we're going to focus on that social situation and try and see how much of an influence that social situation really does have in why people do what they do. For example, Fritz Heider in 1958 came up with the theory of attribution, and we'll talk about these later on, don't worry. But basically what he's saying is that people love to people watch. Just like you, remember you said most of you at least, said that you did like to people watch. And what you're doing is you're saying, hey, why did they do what they do? Why did he say that? Why did he do that? Why did she act that way? What you're doing is you're creating an attribution, right? An attribution is the source of why it happened. Why did the behavior happen? And in general, people tend to make one of two attributions, an internal attribution or an external attribution. So just like we were saying with Kurt Levine, people do things because of the individual internal reasons or the external situational reasons. We as humans really like to focus on either one or the other. Why did he yell at me? Well, because he's an evil person. What we're saying is his internal attribute, his personality is he is evil. We rarely consider the external attribution. Well, in reality, there's a lot of people watching who wanted him to yell at me and he wanted to show off for them. And so the social situation is really what was going on, and that's why he yelled at me. So Fritz Heider is a people watcher. But what he's saying is that we tend to underestimate the external and overestimate the internal when we attribute a cause to people's behavior. One of the most famous studies in social psychology is the Milgram study. So it asked this question: would you harm an innocent stranger if ordered to do so? Milgram ran this study at the end of after World War II, when they were doing the crimes against humanity and the war crimes tribunals for war criminals, the Nazi war criminals. And more than once, he heard the excuse from the Nazi war criminals saying, hey, I was just following orders. And instead of just saying, oh, that's awful, he said, well, I wonder, how much of an influence would the situation, the social situation of being ordered to do something, actually influence somebody's behavior? So, would somebody harm an innocent stranger if ordered to do so? Now, let's think about this in terms like a social psychologist. A social psychologist, you say, hey, that person just harmed the other person, all right? So, person A harmed person B. Why did person A do it? Generally, when people watch that, they say, wow, I can't believe you would do that. You must be an evil person. They give an internal attribution. They talk about the person reason why somebody would do something. They tend to underestimate the social situation. And in this case, Milgram wanted to know if the social situation is that I'm being told to do this by an authority figure, and even though I personally don't think that you should harm somebody else, the situation is dictating that I'm supposed to do that, would I actually do it? So here's what he did. Participants were informed that taking part in an experiment about the effects of punishment on learning, right? So it's about punishment. And they were assigned, they were volunteers, right? They were paid in advance, so it's not like they're doing this for money. Okay. The learner was what's called a Confederate. Now, a Confederate is nothing to do with the Civil War in the South. That's not what it's talking about. The Confederate is somebody who's in on the experiment. So what's going on is the Confederate, the person who's a learner, is an actor, pretending to be a participant, but instead is an actor who's supposed to act a specific way in the experiment. The teacher is the real participant. And what happens is the teacher reads off a list of words, and if the learner gets them wrong, the learner gets shocked. The teacher, the real participant, is supposed to shock the learner every time they get something wrong, and each time go up in voltage so that each punishment is more severe after each error. Well, because the Confederate is in on it, the Confederate is going to answer the same way every time and is going to get exactly the same things wrong. And what we're testing here is to see, will people give the participant shocks all the way to the end? We should also know that the Confederate was told to act as if to complain about a heart condition and to at one point at least just stop answering. They were in another room, right? But they just stopped answering. And so basically the person administering the shocks, the real participant, basically believes that they might have killed this other person. Well, how many people are actually going to do that? How many people would actually administer all 450 volts going up the range of all the volts? When you ask psychiatrists, professional psychiatrists, before this experiment was done, what percentage of the participants would actually give all the shocks? They said, oh, it's going to be really, really rare. Maybe, 2% would do it because, most people don't have that personality trait. What they found was 65% of people administered all of the shocks. 65%, about 2/3, gave all the shocks, even when they basically believed that they had killed the other person. Now, it's not like they found 100 people who happened to love, killing people. That's not what happened. In fact, many people said, hey, they were really uncomfortable, and they were visibly very uncomfortable with the procedure. But they were doing it because the social situation pressured them to do it. They were being obedient to an authority figure, not because of their personality trait, but because of the social situation. All right. The conclusion is ordinary people are willing to harm an innocent stranger if ordered to do so by someone in authority, because the social situation is that strong. We as humans underestimate the effect of a social situation in our behavior. A real life example of this happened later on. This was in the Gulf War in the 90s. And what happened is Abu Ghraib prison was a prison in Baghdad, Iraq. And what they found is that American guards in the prison were basically torturing and intimidating and humiliating the Iraqi prisoners. And why were they doing this? Well, were they evil? Were they sadistic and they loved to do it? Or did the social situation end up causing people to act in very cruel ways? Social psychology would say, don't underestimate the social situation. Don't underestimate what people are doing in their social situation. Why do we need a science of social behavior? So why science? Why can't we just use our impressions? As we've said before, common sense and intuition is not reliable. Birds of a feather flock together or opposites attract? Well, common sense says both. We use science to be able to figure out which one is actually correct. People make errors in their informal thinking of social behaviors. They make biased judgments, like the holier than thou effect. They think that they're different somehow and that these things don't apply to them. And social behavior is often counterintuitive. So for example, we overestimate the individual causality. What I've been talking about before is called the fundamental attribution error. We tend to overestimate how much individual personal attributes are causing a behavior and underestimate the social situation. Are there other ways that this is done besides social psychology? Well, let's make a yes, there's a short answer, but let's kind of make a distinction between social psychology and two other fields. So sociology. In sociology, it's not social psychology. Sociology is looking at the behavior of people in the aggregate. That means a group's behavior. Whereas social psychology thinks about the individual in the group's behavior. So, for example, a sociologist might study how 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 African Americans are affected by voting policies, whereas a social psychologist would look at how someone's race, being African American, would affect their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors about, say, politics or voting. Personality psychology is kind of the opposite of social psychology. It's still looking at the individual, but it's focusing on the personality, the internal part, whereas the social psychologists look at the situation part. So if you're thinking about this in terms of Kurt Levine's field theory, the personality psychologists focus on the individual. The social psychologists focus on the situation. What makes social psychology a science? Well, we use the scientific method, that's why. But first, there's actually a set of values that we need to talk about. Those values are values that are inherent in anyone who's doing good science: accuracy, objectivity, skepticism, and open-mindedness. Those set of values allow us to do good science in the scientific method. So besides those values, which are part of what the background of scientific method, we use research methods that are the scientific method. We run, hopefully, good experiments in order to create the conclusions, come to the conclusions that we do about these psychological phenomena. And with that, we are able to understand all the behaviors that we care about whenever we're people watching, but this time we can do it with actual data and the use of the scientific method.